This is the second episode in a series of episodes about the 4 core performance skills. Today, I'm going to be talking about the first of these specific skills, sight reading. Hello and welcome to the Musician Toolkit, episode number 85. My name is David Lane, and it is great to be with you once again. And obviously I'm not in the best voice right out of the gate, but through the magic of editing, I can take a drink of water, clear up my voice, and hopefully this will be good going forward. So we're in the second episode of what is, at least for now, a 5-part series, and I'm really excited about this. This is one of those ideas that hit me earlier in the year. And sometimes you get an idea and it just stays with you and it just kind of grows and you realize that this is something that you're really onto. And this is something that I'm going to be using outside of this podcast quite a bit going forward. I'm going to be using it in my lessons. I'm probably going to be doing some other things with it down the road that I'll talk about as it develops. But I want to start off with just getting this out in the podcast world. So this is episode 85, and episode 84, I gave an overview of the 4 skills, what they are, and why they're important. And this is the first of 4 episodes in a row where I will take one skill at a time to go over each individual skill, a little more why it's important, why it's a core skill, and some steps of how you can spend your practice time working on each of the skills. So I'm only going over one of these today, but the 4 core skills, the 4 core performance skills are sight reading, playing by ear, improvising, and transposing. Now again, what do I mean by core performance skills? I mean that in any situation that I've been able to think of, you are using one or more of these skills. So I've been in a lot of situations as a performer. I have played for theater, I have played for churches, I have played for weddings, for banquets, I've played in orchestra concerts, band concerts, I've been a solo artist, I've played for schools. And in every situation that I could think of, I've used some combination or just one of the following skills: sight reading, playing by ear, improvising, and transposing. So I said this before, but I'll say it again. You can be a great musician without mastering or even knowing all 4 of these skills, but you can't be a complete musician unless you're very good or working to get better on all 4. So there are thousands of musicians out there that I wouldn't dare to say that they were anything less than a great and sometimes even elite musician that don't read music, so therefore they don't sight read. But in that case, they are probably very good at playing by ear. They're probably very good at improvising, and I wouldn't put it past them to know transposition. So that's just one example of a type of musician who is very good, but they may be lacking or just completely deficient in one of these skills. But I'll go ahead and say that type of musician is limited in what they can do, so they can't come into situations where they are expected to sight read and have that kind of work. Likewise, if you only sight read and you don't play by ear, you're limited in the situations where you may have to play by ear. So now realistically, you are probably going to be better at one of these skills than the others, but why not shoot for balance? Even if you're not super at all 4, you could be comfortably good in all 4. And each of these skills, I feel like it raises the others and it makes you a more complete, more well-rounded musician. And you don't have to be a virtuoso as far as the level of difficulty of music you're playing to be balanced in all 4 of these skills and to be a very good musician no matter what level of difficulty of music you're playing. Now, before we go on, I want to remind you of something called sub-skills. So this is one of the pushbacks you might say when you hear 4 core performance skills. You might say, well, hold on. Yes, those are all 4 good, important skills, but what about technique? What about music theory? What about music history, ear training? And, there's a bunch of other things that you could name. And I'm going to remind you that the 4 skills that I just named technique, knowledge of music theory, knowledge of music history, and ear training are what I call sub-skills. And I call them sub-skills not to say that they are lesser than skills, but they're kind of prerequisite skills. They're things that you want to be working on that feed into and improve the 4 core skills. So sight reading and playing by ear are 2 very different skills, but they both require good technique. They both require a good knowledge and facility of music theory. They are both helped by a knowledge of music history. And they're both, even sight reading, helped by ear training. I'm going to come back to that in a moment because we're focusing on sight reading today. Well, since last week's episode, I have thought about some additional pushback that relates to sight reading today. And you might say, what about playing something in public that you've been practicing with the sheet music in front of you, or you're playing something from memory? So it's not the first time you've played it, so it's not sight reading, but it's definitely not playing by ear, it's definitely not improvising, and it's definitely not transposing. So is that another core skill? No. It all falls under the umbrella of sight reading. So sight reading is really just a specific stage of a larger process, and that is playing music while reading a written score. Sight reading is technically the first time that you do this, but anytime after the first time where you're playing through a piece while looking at the sheet music, we generally just call that reading. So if you ever heard musicians talk about, let's read through this, it's just a generic way of saying we're not going to practice. We're not going to stop to rehearse and correct mistakes. We're just playing through while we look at the written score. And if it's a situation where you're playing something from memory, well, what did you memorize? Did you memorize playing something by ear? Or did you memorize something you practiced from a written score? So if it's that latter one, then you went through the reading process, which means you went through the sight reading process to get there. So sight reading is just the first step, but it is a very important first step. If 2 musicians playing the same instrument and they have the same overall playing level, that means like the repertoire that they're able to play is identical or very similar. If they try to learn the same difficult piece with sheet music, but one of them is a mediocre sight reader compared to their level and the other one is very good, if it takes the first musician 50 hours of practice to learn the piece, it might only take the second musician 40 hours. And if the musician was an elite sight reader, it might only take them 25 to 30 hours of practice instead of the 50 that it takes for the mediocre sight reader. Sight reading well helps you skip steps. So here's some things that sight reading can help you identify quickly, and this is in no particular order. Rhythm patterns, repeating melodic patterns, recognizing all of your notes, recognizing chord progressions, recognizing intervals, spotting your dynamics, spotting articulations, recognizing technique instructions, recognizing tempo instructions. These are all things you need to address when you're reading from a written score, and the better you are at sight reading, the faster you will notice these things. And when you're not very good at sight reading, you're trying to figure out these things laboriously as you go. So being elite at sight reading means you just catch all of that sooner. A mediocre sight reader might waste several hours figuring all of this out before getting to the meat of learning the piece. Now I want to give you some examples in my own musical career of how being good at sight reading has been valuable for me. And by the way, I have said this many times, but everybody's podcast episode is their first episode, so not to expect that you have heard this before, and it's worth repeating if you have. Sight reading is probably the one skill of these 4 that was not a natural strength for me at any point. I started figuring out music by ear when I was 3 years old, with no technique to speak of. So, it would not be something that would go viral on YouTube. I was playing melodies with one finger. I started taking formal lessons just before first grade, and it was probably I've been told nearly 2 years before I was really reading music. I just really tried to hear it first. I loved hearing and playing back what I heard. I could memorize really well. Transposing seemed to make sense to me. And of course, I loved making up my own music, so improvisation always seemed to make sense to me. But sight reading, I wasn't tested on it that much. And that's one thing that I should probably mention. The piano lessons that I had in school, my teacher was very valuable for some things, but maybe a little lacking, like all teachers tend to be in others. And my teacher did not challenge me much with sight reading. We really didn't go over it much. But when I got to college, I was in situations where I was expected to sight read, and it was like ripping off a Band-Aid, just kind of painfully obvious how much I was lacking in that particular skill. And I took the better part of 2 years to work on developing this skill in a variety of ways. And I came out of college, I went into my undergrad years as a very poor sight reader. So I know I've used mediocre a couple of times. I was not even mediocre. I was a poor sight reader. I think if I'd been tested on it, I might not have even been admitted. But I graduated from college, from my undergraduate years, 4 years later, as a good sight reader, maybe even a very good sight reader. I am still not elite, but I consider myself to be very good at sight reading. And here are some benefits to my musical career because I sight read well. So one is playing for theater auditions. These are situations where an actor is auditioning for a role in an upcoming musical, and they're expected to sing an excerpt, usually 30 seconds to 1 minute, of a piece of music that kind of seems to blend in with the show that's going on. So if it's a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical like Oklahoma, they might be doing something from another Rodgers and Hammerstein musical like Cinderella or Carousel or The King and I. If it's for a more modern musical, especially if it's like something by Stephen Sondheim, it might be another Stephen Sondheim show, or it might be something by Leonard Bernstein, it might be something by Adam Guettel or Jason Robert Brown. The thing is, I am sometimes hired to come in for a day or 2 or 3 to play the piano accompaniment for these auditions, and I don't know what they're going to do until the actor at the auditions hands me the score about 30 seconds before they actually sing. And they may go over with me real quick. Okay, here's where the cuts are. We're going to go from measure 32, we're going to cut to measure 40, and hopefully they've marked all this up, and then they'll say some things like, could you just give me this first note, and here's the tempo that we want to do this. And I look over it really quickly, try to find any things that might really trip me up, try to figure out the rhythm, where my hands are going to go, and just everything. And I've got about 20-30 seconds to figure that out, and then we play. And I might do that for 15 actors. I might do it for 50 in a single sitting. And I know people who do several hundred per day. They work for professional auditions. It's a great episode. I probably won't get it in the show notes, but it's from my Life in the Pit podcast with Jose Simbulon, who has done decades of professional auditions, and his stories are quite interesting. But there's a specific type of pressure for me to play this music well, and that is, if an actor doesn't get the role they want, I want it to be solely because of what they did and not for anything that I did. So I don't want them to be able to say with any degree of accuracy, well, I mean, I could have sang this a lot better if the accompanist had played well. That's not to say that I've played well for every single piece in auditions, but that's my goal. I want it to be me to play well. So I would not get hired for that if I didn't have a reputation for sight reading well. Kind of related to that, I've been hired for playing for singing classes at a local university. This is where everybody is working on their songs, and I might get the music to take home and practice further, but I usually get them when I'm there for the first time. So I show up and here's the music they're working on, and let's go through that. And kind of related to that might be playing for other instrument lessons. So if you're a pianist playing for voice lessons or playing for violin lessons or any other instrument that typically has a piano accompaniment. I know for a fact that if you play for sessions, like for film music or for albums, if there's a chart, it's going to be something that probably just got finished before the session began. So that is a sight reading thing. I haven't done much of that myself, but I've been on the composing end of that. I have given things for people to sight read. If you play for a professional orchestra, or I should say, if you don't play for one, but you'd like to one day, you might have this idea in your head that they get several weeks to months to learn their music for each concert. Well, sometimes they have like maybe a week or two to learn all of their music, and then sometimes they're being asked to sight read on a rehearsal, and they only get 2 or 3 rehearsals before each concert. It's been a long time, but I have been in those situations. There was an example of me playing with a flutist, and I'm sorry if you play flute. I never know if you want to be called flutist or flautist, but I just can't bring myself to say flautist, so sorry. But I played a gig with a flutist, and it was kind of last minute. Her pianist had dropped out, and she needed a pianist, and we didn't have time to rehearse, so she's like, can I just bring these several books and you just play along? And I had no problem with that, and the gig went very well. If I wasn't able to sight read, that gig would have gone very poorly. Another situation where it's come in, and it's come in for a lot of my friends, and that is being a substitute performer on shows where I have to come in and play the second keyboard part, or I've even played the first keyboard part. Come into a show where I have not rehearsed the music. It might be sight reading on the spot, and it might be a case of, yeah, I got the music, but I haven't had time to really practice it. So it's practically sight reading. And that is something to keep in mind. Sight reading to me is not the literal first time you play it all the time. Sometimes it's just you haven't had time to work out anything in practice, and you're reading the music. And in that case, it doesn't matter if it's the first time or the 5th time or the 10th time. If you haven't had time to work out the problems, then you're still sight reading. And then one that I do each week. I'm not sure how many of my listeners are people who go to the church that I play for at the moment. And I don't know if they'll be amused at this or what, but I'm going to go ahead and confess. I play piano for a local church. I play for Sunday morning services, and I play for Wednesday night choir rehearsals when when we're not on summer break like we are at the moment. And I have been at this particular church since February 2023. And I have practiced a portion of one cantata in that entire time. I have not practiced any other choir piece. I haven't practiced any of the hymns. I haven't practiced anything that I've accompanied other singers on. And it's simply because there hasn't been a single piece yet that I couldn't sight read. So I save myself practice time by having a level of playing and sight reading ability that I can successfully sight read everything. Now, to be fair, I have paid my dues on that. I was 16 years old when I first got my a church job as a pianist, and I was begging the music director every single week, please give me the hymns as far in advance as you can so I can practice them, and let me know what you're going to be rehearsing this Wednesday so I can practice that music. And I'm sure it was annoying to the music director to have to kind of coddle their pianist that way. I'm sure they gave me some grace because I was 16, but I like knowing that I can just say, it doesn't matter. If you want to give it to me in advance, fine. But I don't have to spend all that time outside of my time at church learning the music. Okay. You may, as a musician, you may have other situations, but these are situations, and everything I just mentioned is something that I've done for pay. So it is a professional advantage to be able to sight read well in all of these situations. Now, as far as sight reading goes on this podcast, we've actually had 2 episodes to the art of sight reading, and they are listed in the show notes. And the first one is episode 11 with Erica Sipes, Erica talks mainly about the mindset of sight reading and kind of the psychological approach. So that is probably a good overview episode to review of just like where should your mind be and how should you approach sight reading in general. And then the other episode is episode 62 that features David Holter. And this is specifically about sight reading at the piano. And we get into this episode the physicality of sight reading. So that is playing, understanding how the sense of touch and how mastering your instrument from a kinesthetic standpoint is crucial to being able to sight read well. So what I want to talk about now are the rungs of the ladder that lead to great sight reading. So if you're a student, it's possible that you might have been told to practice just playing some easier pieces and work on the visual things that go into sight reading, such as looking ahead, not stopping for mistakes, and keeping a steady tempo. And all of that is important. You should do all of that. But this is only a small piece of the puzzle. So let's go through all of the stages you need to improve to master sight reading. And this is a very loose order that you should do this. You can certainly probably go out of order and do just fine. And this is not a case of you need to do number one before you go to do number two, but you need to kind of be working on these things. So I guess another way of saying this, you might be listening to this and you might be a teacher and you might be thinking, I like this idea of these 4 core skills and I want to start working on them in my lessons with students. So this is kind of the recipe that I am thinking of with students. We are going to sometimes be focusing on one of these 10 aspects or 2 or 3 of these aspects, depending on the time, depending on the level of focus, as we are working on sight reading. So sight reading to me is not necessarily here, practice sight reading, practice playing something that you haven't played before. That's kind of testing sight reading. You need to be working on the skills that will enable you to sight read a piece well. So the very first one is the technique and knowledge of your instrument, specific to being able to play it without looking at your hands or feet if you play something like harp or organ. So if you're learning your scales, there's a big benefit to watching your hands play them. But to sight read well, you need to master your scales, all of them, without looking at your hands. So you need to be doing some exercises that transition you from watching your hands to not watching your hands. Same thing with chords, chord progressions, chord inversions. Same thing with arpeggios. Same with any technical exercise that you're working on. You want to have a portion of your practice, whether that's a portion out of each month or a portion out of each week, where you focus on doing well without watching your hands. The second is a knowledge of music theory as it relates to performance. It's fine to know your secondary dominant sevenths. It's fine to know your secondary leading tones and your primary chords and key signatures and everything you can know about music theory. That's just spouting the first few things that popped into my head. But music theory as it relates to performance is do you know what to play? Your hands know where to go. And by the way, I say hands a lot. I'm leaving out vocalists, but I'm sure that you can translate that when it comes to, vocal performance. There are specific things that where music theory is something that you not just know in your head, but you execute. So a way to work on this is to take theory concepts that are introduced in textbooks, and when you have examples, play them and get used to playing them really well, and then get used to playing them where you don't watch your hands as you play them. And always be able to articulate what you're playing. So if you're playing 2 chords in a row, you want to know how they relate to the key that you're in. You always want to be able to describe what key you're in. If there are sharps and flats in the key signature, you don't want to just be able to answer on a test. 4 sharps is E major. You want your hands finding the F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, D sharp as it pops up. So physicalizing your musical theory is how I would call this. It's taking what you might know and might be able to do well on a test and putting it onto your instrument. So knowledge at work is what we're doing. Well, the third one is an obvious, and that is you need to improve your recognition of all notes in the clefs that you use. So if you only play flute and piccolo, I still think there's value in knowing bass clefs so that you're able to go to a piano and demonstrate some things, but you can focus on treble clef. But for most people, I'd say you're talking about treble and bass clef. If you play viola, you're talking about alto clef. If you're a composer or a conductor, you should probably be working on all of these clefs, including tenor clef. But you need to be working on your notes, and I am a big encourager of working on not only accuracy but speed and getting rid of all shortcuts. If you need shortcuts and you're just getting started, you need to know every good boy does fine, and good boys do fine always, or my favorite one, grizzly bears don't fly airplanes. This is all very helpful on an elementary school music test. It is not at all helpful when you're trying to sight read, because you're trying to sight read the notes among many other elements of music, and you just don't have time to do a conversion process to get to the notes that you're playing. So you want to learn your notes instinctively. So if you're not there already, I would say a big portion of your practice each week needs to be practicing on somewhere like musictheory.net or some other app that will help drill your notes. Work on accuracy, but then work on speed. Challenge yourself to name as many notes as you can, and get to the point to where you're not even really thinking about it. And by the way, I have a video on my YouTube channel that is a tutorial on how to set up musictheory.net so that you can do this for this very thing. So I will also put that in my show notes. There'll be a lot of links in this episode. The fourth thing is recognition of all intervals, first as just generic numbers. That means that you can tell a third from a fourth from a fifth and so on. And then with specific qualities such as major, minor, perfect, augmented, and diminished. So you want to recognize these at sight, and this is a big part of what you're picking up on when you're playing. I would kind of say that the next step of this, I didn't really include it as a separate step, but types of chords. So knowing your major, minor, augmented, diminished chords, your types of seventh chords, your major 7, minor 7, dominant 7, diminished 7, half diminished 7th, putting all of these in inversions, and knowing them in all of the keys. And if that all sounds overwhelming, these are things that you need to be working on. So you're part of your sight reading practice needs to be working on these skills. And again, it's all related to what they look like on the staff and then naming them with your hands. There's one app, by the way, I recommend. I don't have a tutorial on it, but I may have to do it later. And it's called Note Rush. And Note Rush is really helpful because you are identifying the note by playing it correctly on your instrument. And it is octave specific. So like you can't just click the letter C if it's a third space C, and you can't play a middle C if it's a third space C. You have to play that specific C. So that app is called Note Rush, and there may be others like it, but that's one that you may also want to try, because again, it's about playing your musical theory. All right, the fifth thing that you really need to be working on that will really help your sight reading is practice learning written rhythms in a way that is pattern-based. And an invaluable episode for you to check out if you haven't, or go listen to it again, is episode 38 with David Krosner. Again, that's linked in the show notes. And that episode is called Deciphering Written Rhythms. And something that he brought up on that episode that I have thought about ever since, and never realized that this is really important until he brought it up. It's more than just saying that in 4/4 time a quarter note gets one beat, a half note gets two beats, 2 eighth notes together make one beat. It's more than that. That's like memorizing letters. In rhythm, you want to memorize words, and that is to say patterns. So for example, you want to get to the point to where every time you see this following rhythm, eighth, quarter, quarter, quarter. So eighth, quarter, quarter. That's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and you just want to learn that eighth, quarter, quarter is this pattern. da 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 da. So dun dun, it's the same thing from West Side Story. Bum 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 bum. That's not West Side Story. What is that? I think that's a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. Comedy Tonight. But da 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 bum 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 bum. That's a word, and it's a pattern. And so when you see eighth quarter, quarter in your sight reading, you're not counting 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, but it's like a vocabulary word. It just pops to your brain, and you go, oh yeah, that's da 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 da. If you play two hands and you do polyrhythms, if you do something like the piano and you want to do 3 against 2, I just automatically remember that's like going hark, how the bells, dun, da, 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 carol of the bells, or chim, chimmery, and the hand with the triplet is playing 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and the hand that's playing eighth notes, regular duplets, is going 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3, dum, ba, ba, bum, bum, ba, bum, bum, and so you put all of that together. I would say see if you can kind of memorize how to execute 10 different rhythms and 20 different rhythms and then 40 different rhythms. So like you're working on vocabulary words, work on rhythmic patterns, and work with your teachers, or teachers do this yourself. Come up with cards or little measures, like here's a 1 or 2 measure pattern of a rhythm you might see. And again, just practice playing it. Get past having to count it. This may be a little bit controversial, but counting your rhythms is not supposed to be something you do all the time. It's what you do as you're learning the rhythm and as you're verifying the rhythm. But rhythms are something that you just play. They're just something that you just play after a while. So, and you want to sight read well by not having to count so hard with the rhythms as you're doing it. Because again, just like the notes, there's more things to do besides that. All right, the sixth thing is you want to work on your ear training of your intervals, chords, and scales. So this might be surprising to some of you. You need to work on your ear training to be good at sight reading, even though you're not playing by ear. And that is because your ear can help guide you what to play. As you're playing the music, you're not just looking at it, but you're listening to it. And your ear can kind of guide you as to things that you've done before, like you can tell, oh, this really sounds like this wants to go to an A minor chord here, or this sounds like it wants to go to an F major. You can also see the notes and hear what it sounds like. So like you see a perfect fourth and you know what that sounds like, or you see a second inversion chord and you know what that sounds like. And of course you see a scale and you know what it's going to sound like when you get there. That helps you know what to play. So again, there's a lot of ear training you can do, but focus on improving your ability with your ear to recognize intervals, chords, and scales. Now that is a sub-skill, and that's going to be something that I'm going to say you need to be working on. All of the other skills, but specific to sight reading, focus on intervals, chords, and scales. All right, number 7, for pianists, and again, if this podcast struggles in some way, I'm trying to speak to all musicians, but I am a pianist, so it is what I understand the best. But you should work on chord-based exercises with choral voicings. 2 examples of that would be playing from a hymnal and playing chorales, like Bach chorales. The reason I recommend these is that they're written in a way to represent smooth, choral-like voice leading, and it's the kind of voice leading that you get in a lot of Baroque, classical, and Romantic era music. And it goes without saying, it's what you get out of a hymnal. I haven't practiced a hymn in so long because I know exactly what to expect. Playing from a hymnal has a lot of specific benefits of music because, especially when it comes to sight reading, because you get a lot of notes in the bass clef that you can't play entirely with just the left hand. Because it's very common to have the distance of a bass to tenor note to be way beyond an octave, often a 10th, sometimes a 12th, but almost every time, like 99.9% of the time, if that tenor note is way too far from the bass note to grab with the left hand, it's within an octave of the soprano, so you could grab it with the right. So playing from a hymnal well involves the practice of quickly recognizing that not everything in the treble clef is right hand and not everything in the bass clef is left hand. And so sometimes you have to very quickly make the decisions. I need to grab that tenor note, that upper bass clef note, with my right thumb. So this is very good practice for this. So even if you don't ever plan to be a church pianist, you will get a lot better at sight reading certain types of things. And this is also, by the way, practicing from a hymnal is going to really help with your improvisation. It'll probably help you play by ear as well. So definitely I would recommend practicing a hymnal. Go to a used bookstore. You can find hymnals, very inexpensive there. Doesn't matter what the denomination is. Practice sight reading from a hymnal. It'll really help you understand chord voicings and voice leading. All right, the 8th approach you want to take is practice multiple ways of playing any chord when you see it as a chord symbol. So this is a little different. This is saying read or have your teacher call out C major 7. Okay, C major 7 is C, E, G, B, so you play that all with the left hand or you play it all with the right hand. Okay, well then start dividing it, the multiple ways you can play it. So C, G in the left, B, E in the right, or change that to E, B in the right. Try C to B in the left, E to G in the right, and then make it G to E in the right. There's probably over a dozen ways that you can mix and match those notes without even changing the C being the lowest note of how you can play that chord. And you want to practice a variety of ways. So you look at C major 7, the chord symbol, and you just want to practice the many ways that you can play that. And you try that with a variety of chords. Because sight reading can include sight reading a lead sheet as well. And this is where you're playing something you haven't played before, but you're playing the right hand melody, but your left hand is having to decipher chord symbols. So have specific portions of your practice where you work on chord symbols, but not just what is it in a textbook definition, but how would you play it in a variety of ways. Okay, the 9th and 10th thing, these are more specific practice strategies that will help feed into your sight reading. And the 9th one is very specific. It's practice implementing all of this in very easy music that you're sight reading at first. So take something super easy, and you should really almost very badly underestimate how difficult of music you can play by just going super easy at first. But make it a regular part of your practice schedule, and you keep progressing to more difficult sight reading as you go. And I would recommend there's 2 things you should be doing with this. Sometimes you want to practice for high accuracy at a very slow tempo. So go really slow, but try to get the notes as correct as you can. And then other times, you need to try to go as close to full speed as you can, knowing that you're probably going to miss more notes, and just settle for less than excellent as far as accuracy goes. This will really help you be more prepared for these situations. And this is something, this is a rant, by the way. A lot of method books encourage only the type of sight reading where it says take a slow tempo, keep your eyes ahead. Well, if you're in a situation where you have to play for an audition, the first example that I gave, a theater audition, the actor is not going to be understanding of you taking it under tempo. They want you to take it at the tempo they want to sing it, so fully 100% up to tempo. And you might have to determine whether or not you can play all the notes or you need to kind of leave some notes out. That's part of the process, in that situation. But, how can you make it sound like what they're expecting to hear is close to it, but you have to do it up to tempo. So part of your practice needs to be full tempo, something you haven't played, but leaving out notes or, just settling for the fact you might miss more notes than you're comfortable with. It's just getting used to that. So make sure that that is part of your practice as well. And the 10th and final thing for now has nothing to do with sight reading at all, except for how it helps. You want to keep pushing yourself with at least one piece at a time that is very difficult for you, one that you have to grow to get better. So here's the problem and the limitation with, like, let's just say that you just wanted to be really good at sight reading and all you ever did was practice sight reading. Well, we still have a physics problem when it comes to music, and that is kind of like traveling at light speed or the speed of light. You cannot, with any conventional means or any technology that we have today, you cannot go faster than the speed of light. You can approach it, but you'll just get to like 0.99%. You'll never actually go, you won't break the light barrier. That's something that makes great science fiction, but it's not science fact. Well, here's another law of physics when it comes to music. You will not sight read music that is beyond your playing level of difficulty. If the hardest piece you've ever played is the Opus 36 number 1 Sonatina of Muccio Clementi on the piano, you're not going to be able to sight read any Beethoven sonata very well because that's a much harder piece. But you know what you could do? You could sight read that Clementi Sonatina rather easily if you could play several Beethoven sonatas, because you have improved your threshold. And this is what I try to tell every student when we get started. There's too much piano music in the world. You're not going to learn every single piece of music ever written. It's just not going to happen. And you don't have time to learn how to play everything that's ever been written. And if you're getting a late start, or you're not able to put in just the huge volume of practice time that you need, there are always going to be pieces that are very difficult for you to play. But the journey of music is about reducing the number of pieces that are above you and increasing the number of pieces that are below you in terms of what you can handle. And as you move up that ladder of difficulty, you've increased the level that you can sight read. So if I want to be able to sight read something by Stephen Sondheim at an audition, I need to be able to play music that is much more difficult than that, in addition to all the other things that I said. So I cannot stress this point enough. You need your practice of, and this is practically a sub-skill, by the way, you need to push the boundaries of how difficult of music you are able to learn in order to affect these 4 core skills in a positive way. Growth in one leads to growth in the other. Okay, I forgot to mention at the beginning, again, I really think that this is an important topic. I'm sure I left out some things about sight reading, and I'm going to leave out things about the other 4 core skills. This is just an overview to get you started with this specific skill, but I am almost certainly, not almost, I am certainly going to be coming back to each of these skills as a topic. And we're going to talk about them because they are that important. This was a lot of information. Depending on which platform you listen to as a podcast, like I know Apple Podcasts does this. I've never tested it on Spotify. But there are chapter markers for this episode. So you may want to save this episode and you may want to come back and listen to certain points again. But start putting this to work. It is really important for you to work on your sight reading to do very well. And even if you are pretty good, you can always become better. And I hope that you heard something today as a strategy for how to improve the skills that make up sight reading that will help you become a better sight reader. So that's going to wrap up today's episode 85. And, I can tell you, the next 3 episodes are about this series, so we're going to get to the second core skill next week. Please share this episode if you found it valuable. Share it on your social media feeds, share it in a text or an email with someone who could benefit by listening to this or someone who would just find it interesting. And if you haven't left a review in a while, especially if it's a positive review, hopefully, it would be great if you would leave that on the podcast app of your choice. And if you're listening on YouTube, please click the like on this video and please subscribe to my channel. I've got a lot of things coming up that are not just related to the podcast. So if you are into piano or composing, I'm going to have a lot of content for you here on YouTube. My link for my YouTube channel is in the show notes for every episode. Follow me on Instagram at David Lane Music. Follow me on Facebook at David M. Lane Music. And you can also follow me on TikTok at David Lane Music. So that's going to wrap up today's episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back with you again next week.